Welcome to Thursday's edition of Renew Plus. I'm Pastor Tony. Thank you for joining us again today. Again, we're in our first week of our merged access road. I know it's kind of getting complicated on grace and faith. And I think if you have followed this course along, you see, the method to the madness, so to speak. You see how we're leading this thing through. And the reason we're having to spend this kind of time on it, because this is new covenant thinking. This is a new covenant mindset in Christ. In other words, we didn't come into this thing with this kind of mindset. We came in with more of a self-reliant, self-centered, self-righteous, works-oriented type of mentality. And God has to change that in order to bring us into the good things that He has for us in Christ. See, faith is not just some kind of abstract entity out there. Faith is actually a mindset. It's a way of thinking. It becomes a way of life, but you have to think according to this way. And the reason we're talking about grace and faith is because when you think about faith, you also have to think about grace. Because faith responds. Our faith responds to what God has already done and already provided free of charge through the finished work of Jesus. If it weren't for the grace of God, our faith would have nothing to respond to. But our faith responds to the grace of God. It accesses everything that's available for us, from the initial new birth experience and salvation all the way through to all the good things, the blessings and the benefits that accompany that salvation, that are included in that salvation. So we have to think about salvation as a whole salvation. That would be the whole person. Everything in our life was negatively affected, and man's life was negatively affected by sin and the fall of man. Likewise, a complete, full, perfect salvation would also have to deal with positively and restore back to us everything that sin tainted and got in there and corrupted. And it does. This is a complete salvation. It's not like going and, buying a car, so to speak, where you have, you buy a car with just the base standard equipment and that's it. And you said, well, I would like air conditioning. I like a radio, MP3 player. I'd like some other things on there, but I can only get this base model. All those other things are optional equipment. Well, many times we treat salvation the same way, that salvation is kind of like buying a car where you only get that base, model, and then the rest of it, like peace and healing and victory in life, the blessing of God in our life, the fellowship of God in our life, is all kind of optional stuff that maybe we get when we earn more and we can buy more. Well, that's not the way this operates. The salvation that God's provided for us in Christ by His grace is a complete salvation. Everything, there's no base model and then you add optional equipment. It's all complete and full salvation is provided for, paid for by the finished work of Jesus, by His shed blood for us. But you can only access that, receive it, walk in it, and enjoy it when you mix your faith with that grace. Now, let's look over to the book of Galatians today. Again, we were in Galatians in the last access road on grace, but now we're going back to that and viewing it in light of what we're talking about here, in light of grace and faith. So we're going to go back to Galatians chapter 2 once again. Actually, we're going to pick up one verse we did not cover in the grace access road. Verse number 16 is where I want to start with. Verse 16 says, knowing. See, we ought to know this. This is something, what does knowing mean? A mindset. This is something we have to not just know by mental assent, mental agreement, but we have to know in our heart and be able to live this way. This ought to affect our life. It says, knowing that a man is not justified by the works of the law. Now, we've already talked about that justification right there. What does that mean? That means we're forgiven of sins. That means there's no condemnation, no guilt, no shame hanging over our head. There's no sin debt still in our account. See, none of that stuff is there anymore. Justification means God is treating us. He's looking at us just as if sin never existed in our life. Just as if means justified. So notice, knowing that a man is not justified by the works of the law. We talked about yesterday, Romans chapter 3, verse 27, that there's two laws, that you're working on one or the other. There's one law or another that you're operating in right now in your life. You're either operating under the law of works, that's in other words, faith in yourself, self-reliance, self-righteousness, self-centeredness, or you are operating according to the law of faith. The law of faith in God, in Christ, in the grace of God, and what is provided for us, what is done for us, what is completed for us in the finished work of redemption. So it says we are not justified by the works of the law. That law of works will never get you there. Self-reliance, self-trust, self-works will never get you to justification. But notice, we're not justified by the works of the law, but by faith, by the law of faith in Christ Jesus. Even we have believed in Christ Jesus, that we might be justified by faith in Christ and not by the works of the law. For by the works of the law no flesh shall be justified. That law of works is never going to get you there. You're always going to hit the ceiling and come short. But the law of faith will break out the ceiling. It'll take you up to the highest place of righteousness and seat you at God's own right hand in heavenly places. See, that's a qualification you cannot deserve, earn, or merit on your own. God is the one who justifies us to receive the inheritance that He freely gives us, makes available for us in Christ. Now let's look on down to verse number 20. Now this is familiar to us right here, familiar territory for those who have been with us the last few weeks. But Galatians 2:20, it says, I have been crucified with Christ. Now Paul's talking first person here. Now he wasn't literally on the cross as we pointed out, but by identification he was on the cross with Jesus. Jesus completely, totally identified with us, with mankind in our sin and fallen state, so that we could completely, totally identify with Him in His crucifixion, burial, resurrection, and ascension and seating at the right hand of God. Now notice, he said, I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live. That old man is no longer in existence. That old sinner man, that old man who was condemned, who was attached to the first Adam, who received that condemnation from the first Adam. Notice right there, he says, that person no longer exists. Why? Because I was crucified with Christ. That brought an end to that old man. I'm not just a changed person, I'm a different person. I'm not the same person I used to be. He said, because I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me now. In other words, Christ in His righteousness, in His justification, lives in us now. 1 John chapter 4, verse 17, I quote it a lot. As Jesus is, so are we right now in this world. Paul is so closely identified with Christ, with Jesus, that he says, I was crucified with Him. That ended the old man of sin. And now the life what I'm living now is Christ living inside of me. And no, there's nothing wrong with Him. But Christ lives in me. And notice, and the life which we now live in the flesh. I want you to see that right now. There is a life for us right now in the flesh. God never intended for us just to go through the initial door of salvation and then just basically are held in a holding pattern circling the airport till someday we land in heaven. That is not God's intent. God intends for us to reign as kings in this life. He intends for us to be a display, an ornament of His grace, what His grace can do in every single person's life because of the finished work of Christ. So he says, the life which we now live, right now, present tense, in this physical life that we now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave Himself for me. Now we pointed out earlier in this week that our faith is a response to the love, the unconditional love that God has for us, and also the abundant grace of God and what it has provided and done for us in Christ. I want you to see that those are the two elements right there that he's living by faith in. He says, the life which we now live in the flesh, I live by faith, listen, in the Son of God who loved me and who gave himself for me. So notice right there, his faith is tied directly into the love of God in Christ and also the grace of God, Christ giving himself for us in his death, burial, and resurrection. See, faith is responding to those right there. That's what Paul's saying. The life I'm now living is fueled by faith in the love of God in Christ and the grace of God in Christ. Now notice in verse number 21, he says, I do not set aside the grace of God. Again, we pointed out that actually means when he said set aside, that means I do not frustrate, nullify, and negate the grace of God and what it wants to do in my life by putting it aside. He said, I do not set aside the grace of God, for if righteousness comes through the law, then Christ died in vain. How do we nullify the grace of God? How do we frustrate the grace of God? How do we negate its effect in our life? How do we stop the grace of God in its tracks, so to speak, and keep it from benefiting us and profiting us in this life? When we stop operating under the law of faith and start operating back under the law of works. Now, listen, he's talking to a group of believers right here. This group of believers came in under this knowledge that we were saved and justified by grace through our faith, and that we ought to be living every day of our life by faith, accessing the grace of God. That's how we walk in the blessing of God. That's how we rule and reign as kings in this life. But this group of believers right here, they were going backwards. They had some people come in and basically sold the leaven of legalism back in there. In other words, they got the focus off of the gospel of the grace of God, off of Jesus, and that through those works, that legalism that was being sown in there, they thought that through their works, through the works of the flesh, if that was going to take them on to perfection, on to completion. Well, you would have to deny the perfect completed work of Christ in order to bite into that and go backwards. But that's exactly what they were doing right here. They were putting aside the grace of God by putting themselves back under, submitting to the law of works, going back under a set of law, rules, regulations, where they were trying to perfect themselves and earn the blessing of God in their life through their own performance. Now, you know, and I'll tell you, Paul was all over him. I mean, you look at the tone, you go back and read this whole entire letter right here to the believers at the churches of Galatia, and I can tell you right now, it is a scathing letter. Why was Paul so upset right here? Because he knew that was going to move them out of a position of receiving and walking in the blessing of God and ruling and reigning in life back over into an area of works where they're just hitting that brick wall. They're just hitting that ceiling, so to speak, and nullifying and stopping the grace of God in its tracks from working in their life. He didn't want that happening. He had sown too much time and energy and work into them in ministry for them to go backwards. But that's exactly what was happening. And I could tell you, most believers, in fact, all believers who have truly been born again, understand that they were saved by grace through faith. And you know, every believer would agree with what I'm talking about right here in principle. But I can tell you, most believers, I'm talking about most born-again believers who came in the door of salvation by grace through faith, who would agree with this principle mentally in their heads. In their heart, they're just not living that way. In their heart, they're still judging themselves according to their performance. And they still see God judging them, blessing them, answering their prayer, causing good things to come in their life based on what they do, based on their performance, based on what they earn and what they deserve. See, because it requires mind renewal. It requires your mind to be renewed with the new covenant for this law of faith, for this way of grace and faith, for you to go from salvation, grace through faith, on into the blessing of God and ruling and reigning in life by faith. But see, that's why we're here. That's why we're talking about these things, because we're renewing our mind. We're setting our minds right as far as knowing everything that our approach to God, our receiving from God, is all by grace through faith. Well, that's all the time I've got for today. If you'd like additional materials and resources, go to tonycowan.org. We will see you tomorrow.